Welcome to this next lecture in the biodiversity series. It's about evolution. It answers the essential question of why do we have so much biodiversity? First of all, what is evolution? I have a couple of pictures here of a glyptodont, that's an extinct species, and a modern species, the armadillo. The reason I bring these up is that one of the important tenets of evolution is the idea of descent with modification. So new species come from older species. New species are modified versions of older species. The next major idea for evolution is the concept of common ancestry. And so here's a good example of what common ancestry is. We've got these 6 species of birds found on the Hawaiian Islands, and we can trace these back evolutionarily to one founder species, a species that first arrived at the Hawaiian Islands. And as it made the Hawaiian Islands its home, it evolved into maybe 2 species. And then those 2 species maybe evolved into 4 species until we have these 6 species alive today. They can all trace back their ancestry to that original founder species. And we could actually take any species that's present on the Earth today, any 2 species, and trace back. If we go further back into the Earth's history, we could find a time where they shared a common ancestor. One thing scientists do is they create phylogenetic trees. These show evolutionary relationships between organisms, and they show where common ancestors lie. And so you can see here in this phylogenetic tree that the chipmunk and the lizard, they have a fairly recent common ancestor. It wasn't that long ago, at least geologically speaking, it wasn't that long ago that they had a common ancestor, a precursor to either the lizard or the chipmunk. If we take something like the chipmunk and the lamprey, well, it was a lot longer ago that they had a common ancestor. We can create these trees by comparing the features that organisms have. The organisms have more similar features, like the lizard and the chipmunk both have 4 legs. That means that they're going to be more closely related. Now we use DNA evidence to construct these, and we can actually make even more accurate trees using DNA evidence. Okay, so that's it. The 2 major ideas of evolution. The idea that species change over time, that's descent with modification, and then also the idea of common ancestry. Okay, so why care about evolution? Well, it might be interesting enough to you to understand why we have such a great diversity of species today, millions and millions of species, but beyond that, it's really interesting to understand evolution in that it explains so many of the things around us. Using evolution to explain so many of the things we see in the world around us is actually a roundabout way of looking at the evidence for evolution. As part of your learning standards for biology, you're required to know some of the major lines of evidence for evolution, but I kind of like to think about it in a different way. I kind of like to think about it as, wow, this theory is so powerful that it explains so many of the things that we see. And so I'll explain a few of these for you here. The first thing that evolution can explain is something called comparative embryology, and that is, if we zoom in here, we can see that a bird embryo and a mammal embryo, this is, I think, just weeks into their development, they actually have really similar structures, and we see that across fairly distantly related species, that they have similar structures as they develop from an embryo. Why is that? Well, these species had a common ancestor that developed in the same way. Up next, vestigial structures. Why do snakes have a pelvis? Pelvises are usually used for supporting legs. Why do kiwis, a bird that walks on the ground, why do they have wings? Why do humans have appendixes? Well, it's because those structures are left over from when the common ancestors used those. The ancestor to a snake had legs. The ancestor to a kiwi had functional wings. The ancestors to humans had an appendix that served a function. What about homologous structures? Why do we see similar bones, actually kind of the same bones that are morphed into different shapes, and some are extended, some are shortened, in species as diverse as humans or horses or cats, or we could include whales on here too? Well, these species all shared a common ancestor that had the same arrangement of bones. The bones that you see in any of these species today are modifications upon that original design. We can actually look at the molecular structures inside of organisms and see that for organisms that we expect have a more common recent ancestor, their molecular structures are similar. Their proteins are actually, humans and monkeys have similar proteins, more similar proteins than humans and pigs, for example. Evolution explains geographic distribution. We see more similar species are closer to each other. In South America, we have a group of organisms called Mara, and they look like rabbits, but they have some different features. But in South America, these are the group of organisms we see. Compared to in Europe, we see a whole family of rabbits, different species of rabbits. Well, the rabbits had a common ancestor. The Mara had a common ancestor. The Wallace line is a really fascinating example of this, why we see just primates and on one side of the Wallace line, one side of the Malay archipelago, in between Asia and Australia, and then toward Australia we see all marsupials. Why is there that line dividing them up? Well, because the common ancestor to the marsupials came from Australia, and the common ancestor to the primates came from Asia. Okay, and most significantly, at least historically, was the fossil record. People have been digging up fossils for a very long time, for thousands of years, and so actually the idea of evolution is not new. The further you dig down into the earth, the more you see species that appear to be ancient. The closer to the surface, the closer we have to species that seem to resemble species that are alive today. This really leads itself to the idea of evolution. When you find a glyptodont fossil right near where modern day armadillos are, well, you might think to yourself, the current armadillos came from extinct glyptodont. Okay, one of the most amazing things is, even though the theory of evolution is hundreds of years old, and really thousands of years old, new evidence fits right in. When we started exploring DNA and digging into the genetic code of organisms, we found that what we see actually lines up with evolution really nicely. What I have here is genetic sequences from different species of anoles from the Caribbean. These are a related group of lizards. Each one of these chunks represents a part of the genome, the same part of the genome, from lizards of different species. I'm actually going to grab these here and copy and paste them into a program that is going to analyze these sequences of DNA, and it's going to look for differences. You can take a look here and you'll see that these sequences are very similar, right? A, T, G, A, G, C. I'm not going to keep reading it, but this one starts the same way. A, T, G, A, C, G, C, right? And so there might be some places where we see some differences, and it turns out the more differences in DNA, the more distantly they're related. And that's what you'd expect, right? That as time goes by and that species after species are separated, they're going to build up different mutations. Natural selection is going to favor different adaptations, and so the more distantly species are related, the more different their DNA is. And so this program analyzes that. I'll show you that over here. I'm going to copy and paste the DNA in there. Submit. It analyzes this DNA, it looks for differences, and it creates a phylogenetic tree from the DNA sequences that shows the species that are most related, closer to each other on the tree, and it shows the species that are more distantly related, further away on the tree. I'm going to pause here and I'll jump ahead to when it's finished. Okay, there it is. You can see it created a tree. It showed these relationships with species that are most related or closest together. These two have the most similar DNA. The DNA here and the DNA here are a little bit more separated. The further away they are on the tree, the more distantly they are related. Alright, well, it's impossible to talk about evolution without talking about Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin is not actually famous for inventing evolution. Charles Darwin is famous for amassing evidence and proposing the mechanism for evolution. So how does evolution occur in the wild? And so here is the title page from the famous book on the origin of species. And look, here's what really is important: by means of natural selection. So that's what Darwin and Wallace as well is actually, they're famous for proposing natural selection. One good way to understand natural selection is actually through understanding artificial selection. Another term for that is selective breeding. And so these are actually my dogs. This is Redford, he's a mini Australian Shepherd. This is Charlie, he's a Pomeranian. I want to actually focus on Redford here and say that Redford is a mini Aussie, and so he only weighs about 18 pounds. Australian Shepherds are big dogs. They typically weigh 60 to 80 pounds, and so where did mini Aussies come from? Well, they came from regular Aussies, and here's how it worked. The people that bred Aussies, when their dogs had a litter of Aussies, they took the smallest Australian Shepherds and they bred those together. And then in the next generation, they bred the smallest Australian Shepherds together, and those Australian Shepherds had smaller than average offspring. And of the smaller than average offspring, they took the smallest of the offspring and bred those together. And so as time went on, we had dogs that were smaller and smaller, and so we get a cute dog like Redford. Where did dogs in general come from? Well, dogs in general came from wolves. The concept's the same. There were wolves that were extra friendly, and humans noticed that around their campfires at night, and maybe they started feeding those wolves, and those wolves that are extra friendly, they captured, and they bred them together, and then of those offspring they took the friendliest wolves and they bred together the friendliest wolves, and those offspring were more friendly than the average wolf, and they bred together the friendlier and friendlier wolves until eventually we had today's canines. Natural selection occurs in a really similar manner. It's simply the natural process by which over time a population can change, and so artificially we changed wolves into dogs, but naturally species change over time. The environment changes species from one form to another. And here's how it works. There are several major important steps. There are components that are necessary to natural selection. The first one is variation. So within a population, here's a population of sunflowers, there has to be variety. They need to be not all the same. And we have that naturally. Mutations occur randomly, and when those mutations occur, we get individuals that are different. Some sunflowers are shorter because they had a mutation that made them shorter. The humans are different. When you look around at your neighbor, they're different than you, and it's because they have different mutations than you. We all have different mutations. That's what makes us different. And that's important to setting up natural selection. Another really important concept is heritability. Those differences, those variations need to be able to be passed on. In other words, tall sunflowers produce tall sunflowers. Short sunflowers produce short sunflowers. Darwin understood this idea, even though he didn't actually know how genes worked. The next important component is overproduction. That is, individuals in a population produce too many offspring. These sunflowers produce too many seeds. Not every seed will survive. This leads to competition among individuals in a population. And finally, some individuals are more fit for their environment than others. Some are going to be able to survive and reproduce better. In this environment where the sunflowers are growing, the short sunflowers survive best. They reproduce best. They pass on their genes better than the tall sunflowers. Remember, fitness is a measure of how well an organism can survive and reproduce in its environment, and so this is survival of the fittest. The short sunflowers are the most fit. Since the short sunflowers pass on the most genes to the next generation, most of the next generation will be short sunflowers, or at least more of the next generation will be short sunflowers, and over time, as the short sunflowers pass on more and more genes, the population will become shorter and shorter until it will be dominated by short sunflowers. The population's changed. It used to be mostly tall or a mix of tall and short. Now it's a population that's mostly short. That's evolution. This species is changing. Alright, now that we have a population of short sunflowers, they're not gonna stop there. They're gonna continue to change so that they're more fit for their environment. And maybe in this environment that's drier or something, it becomes important for them to reproduce sooner in the season, and so they start producing pollen earlier in the season. And if these sorts of changes happen in reproduction, well, they might have different reproductive patterns than the sunflowers on the other side of the mountain range. Those sunflowers, it's a little bit more moist where they're at, and so they can produce pollen later in the season. And if these two populations of sunflowers ever come back into contact, their changes make it so they don't reproduce together anymore. They have different timing for reproduction. They've become different species now. Now they'll continue to diverge, continue along their own evolutionary paths. All right, that's it. Evolution by natural selection, the reason that we have so much biodiversity today, and then a quick reminder there at the end about speciation. How does one species become more than one species?